Andre Lee Thomas was born on March 17, 1983 in Muskogee County, Oklahoma to Rochelle and Danny Thomas. He was the fifth of 6 boys, raised primarily by his mother in Sherman, Texas. His family history was marked by severe dysfunction spanning multiple generations, creating what experts describe as, quote, a pedigree that was predictive of disaster. Thomas's maternal grandmother, Vivian, became an alcoholic by her mid-teens and had 9 children with 5 different men starting at age 14. Her second husband, Walter Martin, was violently abusive and in 1973 fatally shot Thomas's uncle Gregory, who was only 17 at the time. Thomas's mother, Rochelle, witnessed this killing and never recovered from the trauma, developing heavy drinking habits, depression, and reportedly being abused by her stepfather. She also believed she received divine messages through dreams and visions, a gift she claimed was passed down to her son. Thomas's father, Danny, came from a virtually identical background featuring generational alcoholism, violence, and mental illness. One of his brothers suffered from alcohol-induced dementia, while another was institutionalized in a mental ward. Andre Thomas himself was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, as were 2 of his brothers. Despite his chaotic home environment, Thomas initially thrived. He attended a Baptist church in Sherman where a Sunday school teacher described him as smart and respectful, often answering questions before she could finish asking them. He was placed into gifted and talented programs at school and received outstanding marks in kindergarten and first grade. His second grade teacher called him a strong and delightful student. However, Rochelle's instability meant Thomas attended 3 different schools in 3 different cities in 2 different states during just second grade alone. She later testified she couldn't even remember where her son went to school because she had so many children, she, quote, simply couldn't keep track of them. The family lived in extreme poverty, often lacking running water, heat, or electricity. At times, they relied on local churches and donations to pay utility bills. Around age 9 or 10, Thomas began experiencing auditory hallucinations. He stated he was hearing the voices of angels and demons arguing in his head. By 3rd grade, he was telling classmates in apparent earnest that he was Raiden, a character from the video game Mortal Kombat. Around the same time, Thomas made his first attempt. He attempted again at age 13 in an incident that involved a butcher's knife. Both attempts were prompted by his mother saying she should have aborted him. Thomas began engaging in petty crimes around age 11, including damaging golf carts and later stealing a car and driving it into a ditch. When he first met with his probation officer at age 12, no parent or guardian was present to support him. His mother frequently missed appointments. On one occasion, she even told the probation officer it was too cold for her son to be outside. As Thomas grew older, his grades slipped and he was forced to repeat 7th grade. He managed to return to the gifted and talented program, but regressed as his family life continued to deteriorate. When his mother announced plans to move the family to Oklahoma, Thomas informed his probation officer, and a judge placed him in a juvenile detention facility. During a short stay in detention at age 15, he developed problematic thoughts and was placed on suicide watch, but received no ongoing mental health services following his release. The justice system effectively became Thomas's surrogate parent, keeping tabs on his whereabouts and overseeing his affairs. He once asked a judge for a work permit so he could pay off restitution and court fees, only to be told that at 14, he was too young to work. Additionally, he began drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana early on in an attempt to quiet the voices he was hearing. At age 16, he became a father when his longtime girlfriend Laura Boren became pregnant with their son Andre Jr. He dropped out of school in 9th grade, earned his GED, and began working various low-wage jobs, including digging graves at Sherman's West Hill Cemetery to support his family. Thomas and Boren married on his 18th birthday in March 2001 when she was 17. They briefly lived with Thomas's mother, but she kicked them out 2 weeks later. With nowhere to live together, Boren and their son moved in with her parents, while Thomas moved in with one of his brothers. After about 4.5 months of marriage, they separated permanently. Boren later moved in with a new boyfriend and in February 2003 gave birth to a daughter. After the separation, Thomas experienced increasingly intense delusions and problematic thoughts. He lost seasonal work mowing grass and struggled to pay for heat and electricity. Because his residence lacked utilities, Lauren began limiting his visits with his son. Thomas remarked to his father that he was, quote, in a circle he couldn't break out of. He obsessed over apocalyptic concepts in the Book of Revelation and became fixated on the dollar bill, imagining a code for his salvation among its symbols. He came to believe his estranged wife was Jezebel and that his son was the Antichrist. He even thought that Lauren's daughter was possessed by an evil spirit. He sometimes covered his mouth with duct tape and refused to speak to his family for days at a time. He reportedly believed he was experiencing deja vu, saying that life kept repeating itself and things were happening over and over again. Around February 2004, Thomas overdosed on quercetin and was taken to a mental health facility in Sherman, where he asked staff to kill him, saying, "Life is too much for me to handle." Somehow, staff let him leave on his assurance that he was going straight to a nearby hospital. When he failed to show up, a warrant went out for his immediate apprehension, but police failed to enforce it. Several weeks later, he overdosed again and stabbed himself with a knife. He walked into the emergency room at Texoma Medical Center in nearby Denison, where an attending physician deemed him really mentally ill and said, "This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill crazy person. Thomas is psychotic. He thinks something like holodeck on Star Trek is happening to him." The doctor quoted Thomas as saying he was trying to, quote, cross over into heaven. The physician referred Thomas to the hospital's mental health unit and filled out an emergency detention order to hold him against his will. But while staffers waited for a judge to sign the order, Thomas simply wandered off. The hospital called the police, but there's no evidence that officers went looking for him at his mother's home or any of his other relatives' residences. The next time law enforcement saw him, he was walking into the Sherman Police Department to make a confession about a terrible incident he had been involved in. The incident he was referring to took place on the morning of March 27th, 2004. Laura Bourne's boyfriend called her father, Paul, in a panic, alerting him that something was terribly wrong at the apartment she shared with him and her two young children. The call set into motion a sequence of events that would reveal the full horror of what Andre Thomas had done less than 24 hours after walking out of the emergency room where doctors had deemed him dangerously psychotic. During the short period where Thomas was still in the hospital, he believed he had received direct instructions from God to kill his ex-wife, his son, as well as her daughter. According to him, he needed to free their hearts from the demons he was certain inhabited their bodies. In his psychotic state, he was utterly convinced that this was a divine mission, a sacred task that God had personally assigned to him. On March 27th, Thomas packed 3 separate knives into his pants pocket. He deliberately decided to bring 3 as he intended to use one knife for each victim because he was worried that God would not want him to cross-contaminate their blood. He believed with absolute certainty that if the blood from each body mixed together, it would somehow allow the demons inside each of them to survive the ritual killing. In addition to the 3 knives, he also grabbed a roll of duct tape. Laura, then 20 years old, lived in a 3rd-floor apartment in Sherman with her new boyfriend and 4-year-old Andre Jr. and 13-month-old Leia. The apartment was located across the street from Fairview Park, where brightly colored slides, swings, and bouncy plastic animals created a cheerful scene that stood in stark contrast to the horror that was about to unfold inside. On that Saturday morning, Laura's boyfriend was at work, leaving her home alone with the 2 kids. Thomas charged up the stairs to the 3rd-floor apartment and kicked the door open, smashing it down and bursting inside. He attacked Laura in the living room. Using one of his 3 knives, he fatally stabbed her, inflicting wounds that caused massive trauma and blood loss. After she was dead, he cut open her chest in a crude attempt to remove her heart. However, in his frenzied and psychotic state, he instead extracted a portion of her lung, which he mistakenly believed was her heart. When Paul Bourne arrived at his daughter's apartment shortly thereafter, responding to the panicked call from her boyfriend, he immediately saw that the door was broken. His heart racing, he bounded up the stairwell, calling out desperately for his daughter. When he reached the apartment and entered, he saw Laura laying on the white carpet with a gaping hole in her chest. He noticed beside Laura's left leg, a $1 bill had been carefully folded lengthwise and positioned so that the eye at the top of the pyramid on the back of the bill was facing up. This dollar bill was a critical element of Thomas's delusion. He had spent hours upon hours studying the symbols on American currency. The pyramid is topped with the Eye of Providence, a traditional Christian symbol representing God's watchful oversight. Above this eye are the Latin words "Annuit coeptis," which translates to "He approves our undertakings." When questioned by police 2 days after the murders, he called the eye evil. A day after that, he explained to investigators that he was the 13th warrior on the dollar bill. By placing this folded dollar bill beside Laura's body with the eye facing upward, Thomas was making what he believed to be a statement about the divine nature of his actions and his role in a cosmic battle between good and evil. Paul, having understood that his daughter was beyond saving, rushed in a panic down the hallway of the apartment. The hallway was strewn with stuffed animals, baby dolls, and plastic toys. He hurried toward the bedroom that Andre Jr. and Leah shared, dreading what he would find. In front of him was Leah's small body on the floor of the bedroom. Next to her was a blood-spattered doll nearly as large as she was. Like her mother, she had been stabbed and her chest had been cut open. Andre Jr. lay on his back in his small bed just above where Leah was found. He too sustained the same wounds as his mother and sister. After carrying out his plans and before Paul had arrived, Thomas had stuffed the 3 organs he had gathered in his pockets. He then attempted to end his own life with 3 strikes from one of his knives. The self-inflicted wounds were serious enough to require emergency surgery and hospitalization, but they were not immediately fatal. When Thomas realized he was not dying as he had anticipated, he left the blood-soaked apartment. After leaving, he walked approximately 5 miles to his father's house, still carrying the organs in his pockets. He was bleeding from his self-inflicted chest wounds, but was apparently able to walk the distance without collapsing. When he arrived at his father's residence, Thomas took the organs and placed them in a plastic bag. He then simply threw the bag with its contents in the trash. At some point during the hours after the incident, Thomas called Laura's parents and left a voicemail message on their answering machine. In the voicemail, he said the following: Sherry, this is Andre. I need y'all's help. Something bad is happening to me and it keeps happening and I don't know what's going on. I need some help. I think I'm in hell. I need help. Somebody needs to come and help me. I need help. Bad. I'm desperate. I'm afraid to go to sleep. So when you get this message, come by the house, please. Not long after, Thomas walked into the Sherman Police Department still bleeding from his wounds. Rather than trying to flee or hide what he had done, he approached a dispatcher and told them directly that he had just murdered 3 people and had stabbed himself in the chest. His first question to police was, "Will I be forgiven?" While in custody, he told officers that God had instructed him to commit the killings. He explained that he believed all 3 victims were demons and said, "I thought I was doing the will of God." Thomas was then taken to a hospital for emergency treatment. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, Thomas told the EMT that he didn't know what was going on. He said, "I just don't understand. I just wanted to die to pay for my sins." In a shocking development, 5 days after his arrest on April 1st, 2004, while sitting in his glass-walled observation cell at Grayson County Jail, Thomas gouged out his right eye with his bare hands. According to sources, he had been reading the Bible when he came to Matthew 5:29, which reads, "If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." Thomas was declared incompetent for trial and shipped off to the secure wing of North Texas State Hospital in June 2004. There, he continued to hear voices and talk to himself and seemed to have a recurring dream where scorpions and tarantulas were trying to eat him. After 47 days of evaluations and medications, state psychiatrist Joseph Black wrote to the court that Thomas had substance-induced psychosis. Black stated Thomas was competent to stand trial and that he might attempt to exaggerate his mental illness by engaging in aberrant behavior. His trial began on February 15th, 2005. During this date, he was only tried for the death of 13-month-old Leah. An interesting issue that was propped up was the nature of Thomas's relationship with Lauren. Thomas, who is black and had been in an interracial relationship, faced an all-white jury. The case took place in Sherman, Texas, a town still remembered for a shocking 1930 lynching and race riot. In the spring of that year, a black farmhand named George Hughes was accused of raping a young white woman. On the morning of trial, as many as 5,000 people descended on the Grayson County Courthouse, hell-bent on revenge. They battled with state police and set the building on fire. Hughes died in a county vault where he had been placed for protection, and the mob pulled his corpse into the street, dragged it behind a car, and hung it from a tree. Most of the town's black businesses and one residence were burned to the ground. The governor imposed martial law, and for 2 weeks the state militia took over the town. Sherman's black community never fully recovered from the trauma, and for the next 65 years, not a single black doctor or lawyer practiced within its boundaries. During jury selection, prosecutors invoked a unique Texas option called the shuffle. The pool of potential jurors are seated in a room, and with no information other than what they look like, either side can request they be reseated in a different order. The order is crucial because each juror is questioned in turn, and if lawyers want to disqualify someone, they must do it then and there. Initially, there were 6 African Americans seated in the first 2 rows. After the shuffle, which proceeded without any objection by the defense, there were none in the first 5 rows. Ultimately, 2 black jurors were questioned and dismissed. When all was said and done, the entire jury, the judge, and all of the lawyers were white. On questionnaires for potential jurors, 3 of the selected and an alternate one indicated they were opposed to interracial couples marrying or having children. One indicated vigorous opposition, saying, "I don't believe God intended for this. We should stay with our bloodline." Another wrote, "I think it is harmful for the children involved because they do not have a specific race to belong to." A third said, "I think we should stay with our bloodline." Thomas's court-appointed lawyers did not object to these statements, and the jurors were seated. Defense counsel did not even question 2 of them about their stated bias, and the one who was questioned was steadfast in his words. Defense attorneys had peremptory strikes available, but failed to use them to remove the biased jurors. The trial judge even suggested he would have given the defense more challenges if necessary. During the trial, the prosecution appealed to jurors' racial prejudices. They elicited irrelevant testimony about relationships Thomas had with other white women. In the last sentence of his closing argument in favor of the death penalty, the prosecutor asked jurors if they were willing to risk letting Thomas ask out their daughter or granddaughter. Views about interracial intimacy were supposedly even more highly charged than those involving interracial violence. Justice Sotomayor later elaborated, saying the following: "Historians have long recognized that interracial marriage, sex, and procreation evoke some of the most invidious forms of prejudice and violence." Ultimately, the jury rejected Thomas's insanity plea and found him guilty of capital murder. 4 days later, he was sentenced to death, and less than a year after killing his family, Thomas went off to death row. After receiving his death sentence in 2005, Thomas was sent to the Allen B. Polunsky unit just outside Livingston, Texas. He still wore mittens to protect his remaining eye, and his meals were served in brown bags because he couldn't be trusted with utensils. Thomas continued to suffer delusions and hallucinations on death row. On one occasion, he stated that his voices wanted him to bash his head. Other times, he thought 6-inch demons were coming out of the walls and playing music by the music group Queen. And then there were days he said he felt fine and was writing music for his mother. On July 14th, 2008, Thomas managed to procure something sharp and slashed a 7-centimeter gash in his throat, requiring 8 stitches. He insisted he was the cause of all the problems in the world, and that if he ended his life, all of the problems would stop. The next day, he reported he had been reading his Bible and got confused because he wasn't sure if it was the voices or his own thoughts telling him to end it. During a psychiatric assessment 1 week later, he said, "The government is conspiring to read my mind. That's why I ripped out my right eye. That's the righteous side. They can't hear my thoughts no more. I cut my throat. Gotta shed a little blood to save the world." By late fall 2008, Thomas was acting much as he had in the weeks leading up to the crime. He felt suicidal again and asked for help, but refused to take his meds. He stopped talking and wouldn't eat. He came out to see his lawyer with scotch tape clumsily covering his mouth and insisted on writing his answers to her questions on a glass partition with his finger. It's shared that Thomas's relapse may have been related to an incident in late November when he found himself in a cell next to an inmate who swore he was the Antichrist. This enraged Thomas, who believed he had already done God's work in removing him from the earthly realm through his son. On December 9th, 2008, nearly 4 years after removing his first eye, Thomas ripped out his left eye as well and ate it. As he explained some days later, he didn't want the government to read his thoughts, so he ate the eye because he was certain they would figure out some way to put it back in. He said he had been reading the book of Revelations and felt sympathy for the devil because it wasn't all Satan's fault, since he was supposed to have been aborted in the first place. After the second eye removal, it was clear the Polunsky unit was no longer appropriate for Thomas. He was transferred to Jester 4, a state prison psychiatric unit in Richmond, Texas. The complex is surrounded by cornfields and sits on property that once hosted the Harlem Plantation, which became a prison farm in the late 1800s. Thomas is still locked in a small cell 23 hours a day, but by all accounts, this facility is a quieter place. He seems more comfortable around other mentally ill prisoners and does not believe, as he did at Polunsky, that they are scheming against him. He hasn't learned to read Braille, and the medicine he is on now tends to knock him out for large portions of the day. His eyelids are now surgically closed over his empty eye sockets, and he receives multiple powerful antipsychotic medications daily. In early 2020, Thomas's case was brought before the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Attorney Catherine Carroll argued that Thomas's original legal representation was ineffective, as his trial attorneys failed to object to the selection of the 3 jurors with bias against interracial marriages. She also said trial counsel did not present an accurate account of Thomas's long-standing psychiatric problems, did not request a competency hearing, and presented a psychiatrist as an expert witness who did not have expertise in cases where mental illness was allegedly substance-induced. Ultimately, this appeal failed and the trial verdict was upheld. They did acknowledge that there was evidence that Thomas was mentally ill, though he was not insane. Thomas was scheduled for execution on April 5th, 2023, but this was later postponed to July 5th of the same year after Thomas's defense continued fighting. His defense team had until that date to prove that Thomas's mental illness rendered him incompetent for execution. As of January 2026, Andre Thomas remains alive on Texas death row at the Wayne Scott Unit Psychiatric Facility. He is now 42 years old and continues to experience hallucinations despite being heavily medicated with antipsychotic substances. A hearing to determine Thomas's competency for the death penalty is scheduled for March 9th, 2026, before Judge Jim Fallon of the 15th State District Court. This hearing is expected to be Thomas's final chance of avoiding the death penalty.